The letter arrived at dawn, and by the time the sun had fully risen, Eleanor Whitmore's entire world had collapsed into a single sheet of paper. She stood in the drawing room with her hands trembling so badly that the maid had to catch the letter before it fell to the floor. Her brother Henry was dead. Killed in battle, the army officer said. 3 weeks ago, and the news had only now reached the house because the roads had been flooded and the messengers delayed. Eleanor did not cry at first. She simply stood there, staring at the fireplace, listening to the clock tick as though it could somehow undo what had already happened. Henry had been the only family she had left who cared for her. Their father had died 2 years earlier, and their mother long before that. Eleanor, at 28 years old, had already accepted that she would never marry. Society had decided long ago that she was too old, too plain, too quiet to be of interest to anyone. She had made her peace with it. She had her books, her garden, and her brother's letters from wherever his regiment sent him. Now even that was gone. 3 days after the news came, a carriage arrived at the estate. Eleanor watched from the window as a tall man stepped down, dressed in fine dark clothing, his posture straight and serious. She did not recognize him at first, but something about the way he moved reminded her of someone. When the butler announced him, she understood why. He was the Duke of Ashcombe. Henry had written about him many times. They had served together, fought together, and according to Henry, the Duke had once pulled him out of a burning building when no one else would go back inside. Eleanor had never met him in person, only read his name in her brother's letters, always spoken of with deep respect and something close to brotherly love. The Duke bowed to her in the drawing room, his expression unreadable. He introduced himself as Nathaniel Ashcombe, and he said he had come the moment he heard the news. Eleanor thanked him for his condolences, expecting him to leave shortly after, as most visitors did once the formalities were finished. Instead, he remained standing near the window, looking troubled, as though there was something else he needed to say, but could not find the right words. Finally he spoke. He told her that before Henry died, the two of them had spoken often about what would happen if either of them did not survive the fighting. Henry had asked him for a promise. If anything happened to him, the Duke was to make sure Eleanor was protected. Henry had been afraid that without a husband or a father, she would be left vulnerable to relatives who cared more about the family estate than about her. Eleanor felt her chest tighten. She knew exactly which relatives he meant. Her cousin, Lord Pembridge, had already sent 2 letters since Henry's death, each one dressed in polite language but carrying an unmistakable threat beneath it. He wanted control of the estate, and he intended to argue that a woman living alone, unmarried, was unfit to manage such a large property. The Duke told her plainly that he intended to keep his promise to Henry. He proposed marriage, not out of romantic feeling, he said carefully, watching her reaction, but out of duty and respect for a friend who had saved his life more than once. He assured her the marriage would protect her from any legal challenge to her inheritance, and that he expected nothing from her beyond the arrangement itself. She would have her own rooms, her own freedom, and his name to shield her from men like her cousin. Eleanor sat in silence for a long moment. Marriage had never been part of her future, not in any version of it she had imagined. And yet here was a man, a duke no less, offering her exactly the protection she desperately needed, asking for nothing in return except that she accept his help. She thought of her cousin's letters, of the lawyers he had already threatened to send, of the very real possibility that she could lose the home she had grown up in. She thought of Henry, and what he would have wanted for her. She said yes. The wedding took place 2 weeks later, in a small chapel with only a handful of witnesses. There were no flowers, no celebration, no joy in the traditional sense. Eleanor wore a simple gray dress, and the Duke wore his usual dark coat. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, neither of them smiled. It was not that kind of wedding. It was an agreement between 2 people who had both lost someone they loved, sealed with vows that felt more like a business contract than a promise of the heart. As they left the chapel, Lord Pembridge stood outside, uninvited, watching with a look of fury on his face. He had arrived too late to stop the marriage, and everyone present could see it in his eyes. He said nothing, only stared at Eleanor with an expression that made her skin turn cold, before turning and walking away without a word. The Duke noticed the look too. He said nothing about it in front of Eleanor, but as they climbed into the carriage that would take them to his estate, his jaw was tight, and his hands were clenched at his sides. Eleanor did not know this man yet, did not know his temper or his habits or the things that made him laugh, but she recognized in that moment that he was not a man who took threats lightly. The carriage ride to Ashcombe House was long and mostly silent. Eleanor stared out the window at the passing countryside, her new husband sitting across from her, equally quiet. Occasionally she glanced at him, trying to understand the man she had just bound her life to. He had kind eyes, she noticed, despite the seriousness of his expression. There was something gentle beneath the formality, something Henry must have seen in him, something that had made her brother trust him with his life, and now, apparently, with hers. When they finally arrived, the house rose before her like something out of a story, grand and imposing, with tall windows catching the last light of the afternoon sun. Servants lined up outside to greet their new mistress, bowing and curtsying as she stepped down from the carriage. Eleanor felt entirely out of place, a quiet spinster suddenly thrust into the role of duchess, standing in front of a house far larger than anything she had ever called home. The Duke led her inside personally, showing her to a set of rooms that had clearly been prepared with great care. Fresh flowers sat on the table, though she noticed he had avoided the lilies, which Henry had once mentioned in a letter that she disliked their strong smell. It was a small detail, but it told her that he had paid attention, that he had perhaps read more of Henry's letters than she realized, or that Henry had spoken of her more than she knew. That evening, they dined together in near silence, the long table between them making conversation feel even more distant than it already was. Eleanor picked at her food, unsure of what to say to a man she barely knew, a man who was now legally her husband. The Duke, for his part, seemed equally uncertain, offering only brief comments about the house, the staff, and what she might expect in the coming days. Before retiring for the night, he paused at the top of the staircase and turned to her. He told her, quietly, that he understood this was not the life she had imagined, and that he intended to honor every part of the arrangement they had agreed upon. She would want for nothing, and she would never be made to feel like a burden or an obligation. He said this with such sincerity that Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, something she could not yet name. She thanked him and retreated to her rooms, closing the door behind her. Alone at last, she allowed herself to cry, not from sadness exactly, but from the sheer weight of everything that had happened in such a short time. She had lost her brother, gained a husband, and stepped into a life she never expected to live, all within the span of a few weeks. As she lay in the unfamiliar bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, she thought about the man down the hall, the Duke who had kept his promise to a dying friend without hesitation, who had shown her more consideration in a single day than most people had shown her in years. She did not know yet what their marriage would become, whether it would remain the quiet, distant arrangement they had both agreed to, or whether something else might grow between them over time. What she did know, lying there in the dark, was that for the first time since Henry's death, she did not feel entirely alone. And somewhere down that same hallway, in a room just as unfamiliar to him as hers was to her, Nathaniel Ashcombe lay awake as well, thinking of the woman he had just married, wondering if he had made a promise to his friend, or if he had, without realizing it, just changed the entire course of his own life. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of the great house, and somewhere in the distance, Lord Pembridge sat in his own study, staring at the marriage announcement in the evening paper, already planning his next move. The first week at Ashcombe House passed in a strange, careful rhythm. Eleanor rose early each morning, as she always had, and took her breakfast in the small sitting room overlooking the eastern gardens. Nathaniel, she learned, kept different hours, often working in his study until well past midnight, and rising only when the sun was already high. Their paths crossed rarely, and when they did, their conversations were polite, brief, and entirely proper. It was, Eleanor told herself, exactly the kind of marriage they had agreed to, convenient, distant, safe. And yet, she found herself noticing things. She noticed that the flowers in her room were changed every few days, always avoiding the lilies she disliked, always replaced with something fresh and simple. Roses in soft pink or white, the kind she had once mentioned to Henry in a letter years ago, back when she never imagined anyone else would read it. She noticed that her tea was always prepared exactly the way she liked it, with a small amount of honey and no sugar, though she had never once told the kitchen staff her preference. Someone had clearly given instructions. One afternoon, while walking through the long gallery that connected the east and west wings of the house, she came upon Nathaniel standing before a portrait of a woman she did not recognize. He seemed lost in thought, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unusually soft. When he noticed her presence, he straightened quickly, as though caught doing something he should not have been doing. He explained, somewhat stiffly, that the portrait was of his mother, who had died when he was young. Eleanor asked gentle questions, and to her surprise, he answered them, telling her small details about a woman who had loved gardens and music, and had taught him to read before he was sent away to school. It was the longest conversation they had shared since the wedding, and when it ended, Neither of them quite knew what to do with the sudden warmth that had crept into the space between them. The staff, of course, had opinions about the new Duchess. Eleanor overheard two maids whispering in the hallway one morning, unaware that she was close enough to hear. They spoke of the strange circumstances of the marriage, how quickly it had happened, how quietly, with no courtship and no announcement beforehand in any of the usual society papers. One of the maids wondered aloud whether the Duke had married her out of pity, or whether there was something else behind it that no one dared to say aloud. Eleanor slipped away before they noticed her, her face burning with an emotion she did not want to examine too closely. She had always known what people thought of her. Too old for marriage, too plain for admiration, too quiet to be interesting. She had built a life around accepting those judgments long ago, protecting herself by expecting nothing from anyone. But something about hearing it whispered in her own new home, in the halls of the house she was now meant to call hers, cut deeper than she expected. That evening at dinner she was quieter than usual. Nathaniel noticed, though he said nothing at first, watching her carefully over the rim of his glass. Eventually he asked if something was troubling her. Eleanor considered lying, offering some polite excuse about tiredness, but something about his direct gaze made her hesitate, and instead she found herself telling him what she had overheard, though she left out the worst of it, only saying that the staff seemed curious about the sudden nature of their marriage. Nathaniel set down his glass. He told her, quite firmly, that it did not matter what anyone whispered in the halls, that he had made his choice with clear eyes and no regret, and that anyone who spoke ill of her in his house would answer to him directly. There was an edge in his voice that surprised her, a protectiveness she had not expected from a man who had described their arrangement as one of duty rather than affection. Eleanor thanked him quietly, unsure what else to say. It was the first time since Henry's death that someone had spoken up for her so plainly, so without hesitation, and it left her feeling unsteady in a way she could not quite explain. Meanwhile, Lord Pembridge had not remained idle. Word reached Ashcombe House through a family solicitor that he had begun making inquiries into the circumstances of the marriage, questioning acquaintances, hinting to anyone who would listen that the union had been arranged with unseemly haste, perhaps to secure Henry's fortune before proper legal review could take place. It was, the solicitor warned, the kind of talk that could grow into something far more damaging if left unaddressed. Nathaniel took the news calmly, though Eleanor could see the tension building in his shoulders as he read the solicitor's letter twice before setting it aside. He assured her that Pembridge's claims had no legal foundation, that the marriage had been conducted properly and the estate transferred according to every requirement of law. Still, he admitted, reputation was a fragile thing, and rumors, once spread, were difficult to undo entirely. Eleanor found herself surprised by how much she wanted to help, how much she wanted to prove her cousin wrong, not just for her own sake but for Nathaniel's as well. He had given her his name and his protection without asking anything in return, and the idea of her cousin dragging that name through scandal on her account filled her with a determination she had not felt in a long time. Over the following days, they began speaking more, discussing the situation with her cousin, comparing notes on his history and his motives. Eleanor was clever, more observant than Nathaniel had initially given her credit for, and she began piecing together details from old family papers that suggested Pembridge's own finances were not as secure as he liked to present. She shared these observations with Nathaniel one evening in his study, and he listened with genuine interest, occasionally asking questions that showed he valued her thinking, not merely her presence. It was during one of these conversations that Eleanor first saw him smile properly, a real smile, not the polite curve of the mouth he offered at social occasions, but something warmer, reaching all the way to his eyes. It happened when she made a small joke about her cousin's terrible taste in waistcoats, and the sound of his low laugh in response caught her entirely off guard. She found herself smiling back before she could stop herself, and for a brief moment, the careful distance between them seemed to shrink just slightly. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, without either of them fully acknowledging it, their household routines began to shift. Nathaniel started joining her for breakfast more often, arriving earlier than his usual habits allowed. Eleanor began waiting in the evenings for the sound of his study door opening, finding excuses to remain in the library nearby, hoping he might join her for a quiet conversation before the house settled into sleep. One evening, a formal invitation arrived for a ball hosted by one of the more prominent families in the county. It would be the first major social event they would attend together as husband and wife, and Eleanor felt a familiar anxiety rising in her chest. She had never enjoyed such gatherings, had always felt like an outsider among the fashionable young women who filled the dance floors with ease and confidence. Now she would attend not merely as a spinster relative in the corner, but as a duchess, with every eye in the room certain to be watching her. Nathaniel seemed to sense her unease without her having to say a word. He told her, quite simply, that she had nothing to prove to anyone in that room, that she was his wife, and that was all the introduction she would ever need. His confidence did little to calm the nervous fluttering in her stomach, but it offered a strange comfort nonetheless. A reminder that whatever else was uncertain between them, he was, at the very least, firmly on her side. The night before the ball, Eleanor stood before her mirror, trying on the gown that had been prepared for the occasion, a deep blue silk that felt far too fine for a woman who had spent most of her life in simple grays and browns. She barely recognized herself in the reflection, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to wonder what it might feel like to walk into a room and not feel invisible. As she turned from the mirror, she noticed Nathaniel standing in the doorway, having come to discuss some small detail about the following day's travel arrangements. He stopped mid-sentence when he saw her, his expression shifting into something she could not quite read, something that made her pulse quicken in a way she did not expect. He recovered quickly, clearing his throat and finishing his sentence in a slightly rougher voice than before, but the moment lingered in the air between them long after he had gone. Eleanor sat down at her dressing table once he left, her heart beating strangely fast, and found herself wondering, for the first time since their wedding, whether the arrangement they had both agreed to so carefully might be changing into something neither of them had planned for at all. She thought of Henry then, of the promise he had asked of his friend, and wondered, with a small flicker of hope she barely allowed herself to feel, what he would think if he could see them now, two careful strangers slowly, quietly, becoming something more. The ballroom was already crowded when their carriage arrived, golden light spilling from every window, music drifting out into the cool evening air. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as Nathaniel helped her down from the carriage, and he held it a moment longer than necessary, steadying her, before tucking it firmly into the crook of his arm. She glanced up at him, and he gave her a small nod, as if to say she had nothing to fear, and together they walked toward the entrance. The moment they stepped inside, conversations paused. Eleanor felt the weight of dozens of eyes turning toward them, whispers rippling across the room like wind through tall grass. She had expected this, had braced herself for it during the entire carriage ride, and yet the reality of it still made her chest tighten with old, familiar anxiety. She was used to being overlooked in rooms like this, not stared at. Nathaniel seemed entirely unbothered by the attention, guiding her further into the room with calm confidence, introducing her to acquaintances with clear pride in his voice whenever he spoke her name. Lady Ashcombe, he called her, and each time he said it, something in Eleanor's chest loosened just slightly, as though the title itself was becoming easier to wear the more he used it. It was during the second dance of the evening that Lord Pembridge made his appearance. Eleanor spotted him near the refreshment table, deep in conversation with a group of older gentlemen, his gestures animated, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry across the room. She could not hear his exact words, but the way heads turned toward her, and Nathaniel afterward told her enough. Her cousin was working the room, planting doubts, smiling all the while as though he were simply making pleasant conversation. Nathaniel's jaw tightened when he noticed the direction of the whispers, but he said nothing, choosing instead to lead Eleanor onto the dance floor for the next set. It was their first dance together in public, and Eleanor's heart pounded as he placed one hand at her waist and took her hand in the other, the closeness between them entirely new and unfamiliar. She had danced before, at smaller gatherings in her youth, but never like this. Never with a partner whose eyes seemed to hold hers so steadily, so intently, as though nothing else in the room existed. They moved through the steps with more grace than either had expected, and somewhere in the middle of the dance, Eleanor forgot to be nervous entirely. She forgot about the whispers, about her cousin, about the eyes still watching from every corner of the room. There was only the music, and the warmth of his hand at her waist, and the way he looked at her as though she were the only person worth looking at. When the dance ended, his hand lingered at her back a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed, and neither of them moved to step away immediately. It was a small thing, barely noticeable to anyone watching, but Eleanor felt it deeply, a quiet acknowledgement that something between them had shifted, that whatever careful distance they had maintained since their wedding was beginning to dissolve. Later that evening, while Nathaniel was occupied speaking with a group of gentlemen about matters of business, Eleanor found herself briefly alone near the edge of the ballroom. Lord Pembridge approached her then, his smile polite on the surface but cold beneath it. He offered his congratulations on her marriage, his words dripping with false warmth, before adding, quietly enough that only she could hear, that he found it remarkable how quickly a spinster with no prospects had managed to secure a duke, and how convenient it was that her brother's fortune had come along with her. Eleanor felt her face flush with anger, but she held her composure, refusing to give him the reaction he was clearly hoping for. She told him calmly that she had no need to explain her marriage to anyone, least of all to a man who had spent more time counting her brother's money than mourning his death. She saw something flicker in her cousin's eyes, surprise perhaps, or irritation at her unexpected steadiness, before he offered a stiff bow and walked away. Nathaniel appeared at her side moments later, having apparently noticed the exchange from across the room. He asked what her cousin had said, and though Eleanor tried to brush it off as nothing important, he pressed gently until she relented and told him. His expression darkened, and for a moment she worried he might confront Pembridge directly, right there in the middle of the ballroom. Instead, he simply took her hand and asked if she would like to leave. Eleanor, exhausted from the weight of the evening, agreed gratefully. On the carriage ride home, the silence between them felt different than it had before, less distant, more thoughtful. Eleanor stared out the window at the passing darkness, replaying the evening in her mind, the dance, the whispers, her cousin's cruel words, and beneath it all, the steady warmth of Nathaniel's presence beside her the entire time. Breaking the silence, Nathaniel spoke quietly, telling her that he was sorry her cousin had spoken to her that way, and that he wished he had reached her sooner. Eleanor assured him she was fine, that she had grown accustomed to unkindness over the years, though even as she said it, she realized how sad the words sounded aloud. Nathaniel turned to look at her then, his expression serious in the dim carriage light, and told her that she deserved far better than growing accustomed to unkindness, that she deserved to be treated with the same respect and admiration he had felt for her since the very first conversation they shared. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. It was the closest he had come to expressing anything beyond duty since their wedding day, and she did not know how to respond. She simply nodded, her heart racing, and turned back toward the window, though she could feel his eyes remaining on her for the rest of the journey home. The following morning, Eleanor woke earlier than usual, her mind still replaying the events of the previous night. She found herself wandering to the family study, where old letters and documents from her father's estate had been stored since his death. She had not looked through them properly since arriving at Ashcombe House, but something about her cousin's renewed hostility made her want to understand exactly what he might be planning next. It was there, buried among old correspondence, that she found a letter addressed to Nathaniel, written in Henry's familiar handwriting, dated only weeks before his death. She should not have read it, she knew. It was not addressed to her, but something about seeing her brother's handwriting again made her hands move before her mind could stop them. In the letter, Henry spoke of his hopes for the future, of his worry for his sister, and of his friendship with Nathaniel, describing him as the finest man he had ever known. But near the end, Henry had written something that made Eleanor's breath catch entirely. He had written that if anything ever happened to him, he hoped Nathaniel might one day find happiness with Eleanor, not merely protect her out of obligation, but truly come to care for her, because Henry believed, more than anyone, that his sister deserved a love built on more than duty. Eleanor sat frozen, the letter trembling slightly in her hands. Her brother had hoped for this, had wished for it, long before either of them had known such a marriage would even happen. She thought of Nathaniel's words in the carriage the night before, of the warmth in his eyes during their dance, of the small kindnesses he had shown her since the very beginning, and wondered, with a rush of emotion she could barely contain, whether Henry's wish might already be quietly coming true. She did not tell Nathaniel what she had found, not yet. Instead, she folded the letter carefully and placed it back where she had found it, though she carried its words with her for the rest of the day, watching him differently now, noticing things she had perhaps been too afraid to notice before. The way his eyes softened when he spoke to her, the way he seemed to seek out her company more and more, finding reasons to linger in rooms she occupied, the way, when he thought she was not looking, his gaze would rest on her with an intensity that had nothing to do with duty at all. That evening, as they sat together in the library, a comfortable quiet settling between them for the first time without any awkwardness at all, Eleanor allowed herself, for just a moment, to imagine a future she had never dared to imagine before. A future where their marriage was not simply a promise kept to a fallen friend, but something real, something chosen, something neither of them would ever wish to undo. Outside, unseen by either of them, a figure watched the lit windows of Ashcombe House from the shadow of the tree line, Lord Pembridge's carriage waiting nearby, his patience for polite tactics rapidly running out, and darker plans already beginning to take shape in his mind. A letter arrived at Ashcombe House on a gray, rainy morning that shattered whatever peace had begun to settle over the household. It came from the family solicitor, urgent and carefully worded, warning that Lord Pembridge had taken his campaign far beyond idle whispers at social gatherings. He had produced a document, allegedly signed by Eleanor's late father, suggesting that the terms of the family will had been altered improperly before his death, and that the estate now controlled by Eleanor and, by extension her husband, had been secured through deception. Nathaniel read the letter twice at the breakfast table, his expression growing darker with each line. Eleanor watched him across the table, her own appetite vanishing as she waited for him to explain. When he finally looked up, he told her plainly that her cousin intended to bring the matter before a court of law, using the forged document as evidence, hoping to have the marriage and the inheritance both called into question. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She had expected rumors, whispers, the usual cruelty her cousin was capable of, but a forged document, a legal challenge, was something else entirely. It threatened not only their reputation, but the very security Nathaniel had promised to provide when he first proposed the marriage. Over the following days, the household transformed. Nathaniel spent long hours locked away with solicitors and family lawyers, poring over old documents, tracing the history of her father's will, searching for any proof that could definitively expose Pembridge's claims as false. He grew quieter during meals, more tired, dark circles forming beneath his eyes from the late nights spent working. Eleanor watched him carry the weight of it all, and something in her refused to simply sit by and wait for the outcome to be decided by others. She began her own quiet investigation, spending hours in the family study going through old papers, correspondence, and financial records that had once belonged to her father. She remembered small details from her childhood, conversations overheard between her father and his solicitor, comments made in passing about her cousin's spending habits and mounting debts. She began piecing together a picture that told a very different story than the one Pembridge was presenting to the courts. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of old correspondence in the attic, she discovered a series of letters between her father and a moneylender in London, detailing loans that had been taken out and never repaid, loans signed not by her father but by Pembridge himself, using the family name without proper authority years earlier. It was exactly the kind of evidence that could unravel her cousin's credibility entirely, proving a pattern of deception that predated even his current claims. Eleanor brought the discovery directly to Nathaniel's study that evening, her hands full of old letters, her voice trembling with excitement rather than fear for the first time in days. He looked up from his own scattered papers, exhaustion clear on his face, and as she laid out what she had found, explaining the connections she had traced, she watched his expression shift from surprise to something like admiration. He told her quite honestly that he had underestimated how much she could contribute to solving this, that he had been so focused on protecting her that he had not considered how capable she truly was of protecting herself, and by extension, protecting them both. Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, a feeling entirely separate from the fear and stress of the past few days. From that evening onward, they worked together as true partners, sitting side by side late into the night, comparing documents, building their case piece by piece. Eleanor found herself enjoying these long hours more than she expected, not despite the seriousness of their task, but because of the closeness it created between them. They developed a rhythm, an unspoken understanding, finishing each other's sentences as they connected pieces of evidence, occasionally sharing a tired laugh when the work grew overwhelming. One particularly late night, as rain lashed against the windows of the study, Eleanor fell asleep in her chair, exhausted from hours of reading old financial ledgers. She woke briefly to find a blanket had been placed gently over her shoulders, and Nathaniel sitting nearby, watching her with an expression so tender it made her chest ache. When he realized she was awake, he looked away quickly, clearing his throat and returning his attention to the papers before him, but the moment lingered between them long after. As the days passed, the pressure from Pembridge only intensified. He began spreading rumors more aggressively throughout society, hinting to anyone who would listen that the Duke himself might be complicit in the alleged deception, questioning why a man of his standing would marry a spinster so quickly, unless there was something to hide. The gossip reached even the more respected circles of society, and Nathaniel found himself facing pointed questions and cold receptions at gatherings he had once attended without a second thought. Eleanor watched him endure this with a stoic patience that broke her heart. She knew he was suffering for a choice he had made purely out of loyalty to a fallen friend, and the guilt of it weighed on her more heavily with each passing day. One evening, overwhelmed by the strain of it all, she found herself apologizing to him, telling him that she never should have accepted his proposal, that she had brought nothing but trouble and scandal into his life when he had only ever tried to help her. Nathaniel's reaction surprised her. He crossed the room quickly, taking her hands in his voice firm and unwavering as he told her that he did not regret a single moment of their marriage. that whatever difficulties they faced now were nothing compared to what he would have felt if he had failed to keep his promise to Henry, and that he would face every rumor, every whispered accusation, 1,000 times over if it meant keeping her safe. Eleanor searched his eyes for any sign of doubt and found none, only steady, unwavering certainty. She realized in that moment, more clearly than ever before, that whatever this marriage had started as, it had long since become something else entirely for both of them. With the evidence Eleanor had uncovered now fully organized and verified by the family solicitor, Nathaniel arranged a meeting, inviting several influential members of society, along with Lord Pembridge himself, under the pretense of discussing the inheritance dispute privately before it reached the courts. Eleanor insisted on being present, refusing to let Nathaniel face her cousin alone after everything they had built together over the past weeks. The night before the meeting, neither of them could sleep easily. Eleanor found herself wandering down to the library long after midnight, unable to quiet her racing thoughts, and found Nathaniel already there, staring into the dying embers of the fireplace. He looked up when she entered, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, simply existing together in the quiet room, drawing strength from each other's presence without needing words at all. Eventually, Eleanor broke the silence, asking him quietly whether he believed they would succeed tomorrow. Nathaniel considered the question carefully before answering, telling her that regardless of what happened in that meeting, he had already gained something far more valuable than he had expected when he first made his promise to Henry. He had gained a partner, someone whose intelligence and courage matched his own, someone he had come to admire more deeply than he had ever anticipated. Eleanor's heart pounded at his words, and for a moment, she thought he might say something more, something neither of them had dared to say aloud yet. But the moment passed, interrupted by the distant sound of a clock striking the late hour, and both of them retreated to their separate rooms, carrying the weight of unspoken feelings alongside the weight of tomorrow's confrontation. As dawn broke over Ashcombe House, casting pale light across the gardens, Eleanor dressed carefully for the meeting ahead, her hands steady despite the nervous energy coursing through her. Whatever happened today, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was no longer the invisible spinster she had been just months before. She had a purpose now, a partner who valued her, and a fight worth winning, not just for the sake of an inheritance, but for the life she was slowly, carefully, beginning to build with a man she had never expected to love. The meeting room at Ashcombe House had been prepared with careful precision, a long table set with documents arranged in neat, deliberate order, chairs positioned to accommodate the small but influential gathering Nathaniel had assembled. Eleanor stood near the window as the guests began to arrive, watching each carriage pull up the drive, her heart pounding steadily beneath her calm exterior. Among the first to arrive was Lady Whitfield, a respected widow whose opinion carried significant weight in society circles, followed by Sir Edmund Carow, a magistrate known for his fairness and sharp legal mind. Nathaniel had chosen his witnesses carefully, ensuring that whatever unfolded in this room would be witnessed by people whose testimony could not easily be dismissed or discredited later. Lord Pembridge arrived last, exactly as Eleanor had expected, making an entrance calculated to project confidence he likely did not feel. He greeted the assembled guests with practiced charm, offering polite bows and pleasant smiles, though Eleanor noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes flickered toward her and Nathaniel with poorly concealed unease. Nathaniel opened the meeting calmly, thanking everyone for attending on such short notice, before explaining that recent claims made against his marriage deserved a full and transparent airing, given the seriousness of the accusations being spread throughout society. Pembridge, seated across the table, nodded along with feigned sympathy, agreeing that such matters were indeed serious and deserved careful examination. Eleanor watched her cousin closely as Nathaniel began laying out the documents she had helped gather over the previous weeks. First came the original will, verified by the family solicitor as authentic and unaltered, directly contradicting the forged document Pembridge had presented to the courts. Sir Edmund examined both documents side by side, his expert eye immediately noting inconsistencies in the handwriting and signature of the forged version that Pembridge had submitted. Pembridge attempted to interject, claiming the discrepancies could easily be explained by the passage of time or the natural variation in an aging man's handwriting, but his voice carried less confidence than before, a slight tremor betraying the cracks forming beneath his composed exterior. Then Eleanor stepped forward herself, something she had insisted upon despite Nathaniel's initial concern that the confrontation might become too difficult for her. She laid out the letters she had discovered, detailing years of unauthorized loans taken out under the family name, debts accumulated and never repaid, all traced directly back to her cousin's own signature and financial dealings. She spoke clearly, without hesitation, her voice steady even as she watched the color drain from Pembridge's face with each new piece of evidence she presented. The room grew tense as Sir Edmund reviewed the financial records, cross-referencing dates and signatures with the practiced eye of a man who had spent decades examining legal documents for exactly this kind of deception. When he finally looked up, his expression grave, he stated plainly that the evidence strongly suggested Lord Pembridge himself had a clear financial motive to fabricate claims against the Whitmore estate, given his own mounting debts and desperate need for funds. Pembridge's composure finally shattered. He rose from his chair, his voice rising as he attempted to deny the accusations, insisting the entire meeting was nothing more than a conspiracy orchestrated by Nathaniel and Eleanor to discredit him publicly. But his outburst only served to confirm what everyone in the room had already begun to suspect, and Lady Whitfield, watching with sharp disapproval, remarked quietly that his reaction spoke louder than any document ever could. Nathaniel remained calm throughout, his voice steady as he addressed Pembridge directly, telling him that he had two choices before him. He could withdraw his claims immediately, quietly, and avoid further public embarrassment, or he could continue pursuing the matter through the courts, where the evidence now assembled would be presented in far less forgiving circumstances, likely resulting in criminal charges related to forgery and fraud, given the severity of what Eleanor had uncovered. The room fell silent as Pembridge stood frozen, clearly weighing his rapidly diminishing options. Eleanor watched him carefully, remembering all the years of quiet cruelty he had shown her family, the greed that had driven him to threaten her security so soon after her brother's death, and felt no pity for the desperate man now standing before them, cornered by his own deception. Finally, Pembridge sat back down, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He agreed, quietly and without further argument, to withdraw all claims against the estate and to issue a formal retraction of the rumors he had spread throughout society. Sir Edmund, acting in his capacity as magistrate, insisted the agreement be documented formally and signed immediately, ensuring there would be no opportunity for Pembridge to renege on his word once the immediate pressure of the room had passed. As the guests began to depart, Lady Whitfield paused beside Eleanor, taking her hand warmly, and telling her that she had shown remarkable courage and intelligence throughout the proceedings, qualities that spoke far more to her character than any rumor ever could. Eleanor thanked her sincerely, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, a genuine sense of pride in herself, separate entirely from her relation to her late brother or her marriage to a duke. When the last of the guests had gone and Pembridge himself had departed in humiliated silence, Eleanor and Nathaniel remained alone in the study, the tension of the past weeks finally beginning to drain from the room. Eleanor sank into a chair near the fireplace, exhaustion washing over her now that the danger had finally passed, and Nathaniel moved to sit across from her, watching her with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before. He told her, quietly, that he had never known anyone quite like her, that her courage today had reminded him why Henry had trusted him with her care in the first place, though he admitted, with a small, almost embarrassed laugh, that it was clear she had needed very little protecting at all, that she was more than capable of protecting herself, and, as it turned out, of protecting him as well. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at his words, and something in the quiet, private moment between them made her bold enough to ask the question that had been building in her heart for weeks. She asked him plainly whether their marriage, which had begun as nothing more than a promise made to a dying friend, had become something else to him now. Nathaniel rose from his chair and crossed the room slowly, kneeling beside where she sat, taking her hands gently in his own. He told her that what began as duty had transformed, somewhere along the way, into something he had never expected to feel again after losing his own family so young. He confessed that he thought of her constantly, that her laugh had become the highlight of his days, that watching her fight for herself and for their marriage over the past weeks had made him realize he was no longer simply keeping a promise to Henry. He was falling in love with her, deeply and completely, and had been for longer than he had allowed himself to admit. Eleanor's breath caught, tears welling in her eyes as years of believing herself unworthy of such words finally began to crumble beneath the weight of his sincerity. She wanted desperately to believe him, and yet old fears whispered quietly in the back of her mind, warning her that perhaps what he felt was simply gratitude, or the intensity of shared danger now finally past, rather than something built to last. She did not say this aloud, not yet, but Nathaniel, watching her closely, seemed to sense the hesitation behind her eyes regardless. He squeezed her hands gently and told her that he understood if she needed time, that he did not expect her to simply accept his words without question after everything she had endured, but that he intended to prove his feelings to her, patiently, for as long as it took, until she believed them as fully as he did. Outside, the first light of evening began to fade into the soft colors of dusk, painting the gardens of Ashcombe House in gentle shades of gold and violet, and inside, two people who had entered their marriage as strangers bound by duty sat together in comfortable silence, both of them beginning to understand that whatever had started as a promise to a fallen friend had quietly, irreversibly, become something far greater than either of them had ever expected to find again. In the weeks that followed the confrontation with her cousin, life at Ashcombe House settled into something Eleanor had never dared to imagine for herself. The fear and uncertainty that had shadowed the early months of her marriage had lifted, replaced by a quiet warmth that filled the halls of the great house in ways she could hardly believe. Nathaniel no longer disappeared into his study until midnight. Instead, he sought her out in the evenings, joining her in the library, in the gardens, at the breakfast table each morning, finding reasons, both large and small, to remain close to her. And yet, despite everything, a quiet doubt lingered within Eleanor, one she found difficult to fully release. She had spent so many years believing herself unworthy of love, dismissed by society, overlooked by suitors, told in 1,000 subtle ways that she was not the kind of woman men chose for themselves. Even now, with Nathaniel's affection so clearly displayed, some small, stubborn part of her mind whispered that perhaps his feelings had grown from gratitude, from the intensity of the danger they had faced together, rather than from anything real or lasting. One quiet evening, as they walked together through the gardens after dinner, the last light of the sun casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed hedges, Eleanor finally gave voice to the doubt she had carried silently for weeks. She stopped walking and turned to face him, her hands twisting nervously in the fabric of her skirt as she spoke. She told him that she needed him to understand something clearly. She did not want him to feel obligated to love her simply because he had promised Henry he would protect her, or because they had faced her cousin's schemes together and come through it stronger. She told him that if what he felt was merely gratitude, or the echo of danger now past, she would understand, and she would release him from any expectation of more than the practical arrangement they had first agreed upon. Nathaniel listened to her carefully, his expression growing more intent with every word she spoke, and when she finally fell silent, he took a step closer, closing the distance between them entirely. He told her, with a firmness that left no room for doubt, that he refused to let her retreat into the same fears that had convinced her for years that she was unworthy of being loved. He said that what he felt for her had nothing to do with duty, nothing to do with promises made to a dying friend, and everything to do with the woman standing before him now. He spoke of the way she had faced her cousin with unshakable courage, the way she had spent countless nights beside him poring over old letters and financial records, never once complaining despite the exhaustion clearly written on her face. He spoke of her quiet strength, the kindness she showed the household staff, the sharp intelligence hidden behind her modest manner, the way her laugh, rare as it was, had become the sound he found himself listening for throughout every long day. He told her that Henry's promise had brought them together, yes, but that everything since then, every quiet conversation, every shared glance across the dinner table, every moment of growing trust between them, had been entirely their own, built freely, chosen deliberately, owing nothing to obligation at all. He loved her, he said, not because he had promised to protect her, but because she had become, without his even realizing it happening, the very center of his life. Eleanor felt tears spill freely down her cheeks as years of carefully built walls finally began to crumble entirely. She had spent so long protecting herself from disappointment that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to simply believe someone's words without searching for hidden doubt beneath them. But standing there in the fading evening light, looking into Nathaniel's steady, unwavering eyes, she finally allowed herself to believe him completely. She confessed, in turn, that she had loved him for weeks now, perhaps longer than she had been willing to admit even to herself, that the quiet moments they shared had become the brightest parts of her days, that she had stopped thinking of their marriage as an arrangement long before either of them had spoken the words aloud. She told him about finding Henry's letter, about her brother's quiet hope that they might one day find happiness together beyond mere duty, and how she had carried that hope silently in her heart ever since discovering it. Nathaniel's eyes softened at the mention of Henry's letter, and he pulled her gently into his arms, holding her close beneath the darkening sky. He told her that Henry had always been wiser than either of them gave him credit for, and that wherever he was now, he had no doubt his old friend was watching them with quiet satisfaction, his final wish for his sister finally coming true. They stood together in the garden for a long while, wrapped in each other's arms, saying little more, simply allowing the weight of everything they had finally confessed to settle comfortably between them. When they finally returned inside, the household staff noticed an unmistakable change in their mistress and master, a warmth and ease that had never quite been present before, whispered about now not with suspicion, but with quiet delight. In the days that followed, Nathaniel insisted on a small, private ceremony, a renewal of their vows, spoken this time not out of duty or promise to a fallen friend, but freely chosen by two people who had come, against all expectation, to love each other completely. Eleanor agreed without hesitation, and together they planned a quiet gathering in the very gardens where they had first confessed their feelings, surrounded only by the people who had come to matter most to them. On the morning of the ceremony, Eleanor stood before her mirror once more, wearing a simple gown of pale gold, far different from the formal gray she had worn at their first wedding. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her, no longer the invisible spinster resigned to a quiet, lonely existence, but a woman fully seen, fully loved, standing at the threshold of a life she had never dared to hope for. The ceremony itself was small and simple, held beneath the same trees where they had first spoken honestly of their feelings. Eleanor's closest friends and a handful of trusted household staff gathered to witness the moment, along with Lady Whitfield, who had become an unexpected but treasured friend throughout the ordeal with Pembridge. As Nathaniel spoke his vows this time, his voice steady and full of genuine emotion, Eleanor felt none of the distant formality of their first wedding day. Every word he spoke was chosen freely, meant entirely, and when he slid the ring back onto her finger, his hands trembled slightly with the depth of feeling he could no longer hide. When it came time for Eleanor to speak, she found the words came easily, without hesitation, without the careful caution that had once defined every part of her life. She told him that she had entered their first marriage believing herself lucky simply to be protected, never imagining she might also be loved. She told him that he had given her far more than safety and security. He had given her a place to belong, a partner who valued her mind as much as her heart, and a love she had long ago convinced herself she would never find. As the small gathering applauded and the late afternoon sun cast warm golden light across the garden, Nathaniel pulled Eleanor close, his forehead resting gently against hers, and told her quietly, meant only for her ears, that whatever had begun as a promise made to his dying friend had become, without any doubt remaining in his heart, the truest and most precious thing in his entire life. He would never let her go, not now, not ever, regardless of what challenges the future might still bring their way. Eleanor smiled up at him, her heart finally, completely at peace, and as they turned together to face the small crowd of well-wishers gathered around them, she understood with absolute certainty that Henry's final wish for her happiness had not only come true, but had grown into something far greater and far more lasting than her brother could ever have imagined when he first asked his closest friend for a simple, quiet promise. Autumn arrived at Ashcombe House with a quiet, golden beauty, the gardens turning shades of amber and rust, and life within the great house had settled into a rhythm neither Eleanor nor Nathaniel could have imagined possible only a year before. Their marriage, once built on duty and careful distance, had grown into something the entire household now recognized as genuine devotion, visible in the smallest of gestures, a hand reaching for another across the breakfast table, a shared glance that lingered a moment longer than necessary, laughter drifting easily from the study in the evenings. Word of Lord Pembridge reached them occasionally through distant acquaintances, though he had wisely chosen to remove himself from society circles entirely, following his public humiliation. He had retreated to a smaller property in the north, his reputation too damaged to maintain his former standing, his financial troubles apparently worsening without the influence he had once relied upon. Eleanor felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only relief that the threat he had once posed no longer loomed over her family's legacy. One crisp morning in early October, Nathaniel found Eleanor in the family study, once again surrounded by old papers, though this time her purpose was far different from the desperate investigation of months before. She had taken it upon herself to properly organize her father's and brother's remaining correspondence, preserving their memory carefully rather than searching through it in fear. Nathaniel watched from the doorway for a moment before joining her, settling into the chair beside hers as had become his habit. He mentioned, almost casually, that he had received a letter from an old regiment colleague, a man who had served alongside both himself and Henry many years before. The colleague had written with news of establishing a memorial fund for soldiers who had fallen in service, and he wondered whether Nathaniel might be interested in contributing, given his close friendship with Henry. Eleanor's eyes lit up immediately at the suggestion, and she offered to help organize the effort herself, seeing it as a meaningful way to honor her brother's memory beyond simple grief. Over the following weeks, the project became a shared passion between them, something entirely their own, separate from the difficulties that had once defined their marriage. They wrote letters together, planned a small memorial garden to be established on a portion of the Ashcombe estate, and reached out to other families who had lost loved ones in the same campaigns Henry had served in. Eleanor found unexpected comfort in the work, discovering that honoring her brother's memory alongside the man he had loved as a brother himself brought a healing she had not realized she still needed. As the memorial garden began to take shape near the eastern edge of the property, Eleanor often walked there in the late afternoons, watching the young trees being planted, imagining how the space would look in years to come, filled with blooming flowers each spring in remembrance of the soldiers who had given their lives. Nathaniel frequently joined her on these walks, and it was during one such evening, as the sun began its slow descent behind the hills, that he shared news that filled her with quiet, overwhelming joy. He told her, gently, that he had recently spoken with the family physician, and that there was reason to believe their family might soon grow beyond just the two of them. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes as the realization settled over her fully. After everything they had endured together, after all the doubt and fear that had once defined her existence, she found herself standing at the beginning of an entirely new chapter, one filled with hope she had never allowed herself to imagine during her long years as an overlooked, forgotten spinster. Nathaniel knelt before her in the golden evening light, taking her hands in his own, his voice thick with emotion as he told her that their child would grow up knowing the story of a brave uncle who had given his life in service, and a mother whose courage and intelligence had saved their family not once, but many times over. He promised that their home would always be filled with the same warmth and honesty that had brought the two of them together, free from the coldness and calculation that had once threatened to tear their family apart. The news spread quickly through the household, met with genuine celebration from staff who had come to deeply respect and admire their mistress over the past year. Lady Whitfield, upon hearing the news during a visit shortly after, embraced Eleanor warmly, telling her that she had never seen a happier transformation in all her years observing society marriages, and that Henry, wherever he now rested, must surely be smiling upon the family he had loved so dearly. As winter approached and the memorial garden settled beneath its first frost, awaiting the following spring when its flowers would finally bloom in full tribute to the fallen soldiers it honored, Eleanor found herself reflecting often on the strange, unexpected path her life had taken. She had begun the year as a woman resigned to loneliness, convinced that love and belonging were simply not meant for someone like her. She ended it as a duchess, deeply loved, expecting a child, surrounded by a household and a husband who valued her completely, not despite her quiet nature, but because of the quiet strength that had always lived within her, waiting patiently for someone willing to truly see it. On a particularly cold evening in late December, as snow began falling softly outside the tall windows of Ashcombe House, Eleanor sat curled beside the fireplace in the library, a book resting unread in her lap as she watched the flames dance. Nathaniel entered quietly, settling beside her, wrapping a blanket more securely around her shoulders before pulling her close against him. He told her, softly, that he sometimes still marveled at how a simple promise made to a dying friend had led him here, to this exact moment, surrounded by a life he never could have planned for himself, yet one he now could not imagine living without. Eleanor rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, and told him that she felt exactly the same, that every difficult moment they had endured together, every fear she had once carried, had led them precisely to this quiet, perfect happiness neither of them had dared to hope for. Outside, the snow continued falling gently over the memorial garden, blanketing the young trees in soft white silence, a peaceful tribute to the friendship that had first brought Eleanor and Nathaniel together, and to the deep, enduring love that friendship had unexpectedly, beautifully, grown into. Inside, by the warm glow of the fire, two people who had once been strangers bound only by duty sat together in comfortable silence, certain now, beyond any doubt, that whatever life still had in store for them, they would face it together, hand in hand, for the rest of their days.